Look, I've been waiting here all morning to file this report, and now you're telling me I can't leave?
Sir, please remain by the vehicle. We're still investigating.
The sound of screeching tires echoed down the empty street. Terrence's heart raced as he slammed his phone back into his pocket, his gaze following the figure racing past him on the sidewalk. A beat-up sedan cut across the intersection, and a flash of white in the driver's seat caught his attention. "Hey!" Terrence shouted, his voice breaking through the tension of the late-night silence. But the car didn't slow, sped off. His pulse thrummed in his ears. His hands trembled as they reached for the door of the cafe, now empty save for the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. The moment he'd stepped outside, a man had grabbed his keys, punched him in the face and taken his car. The rush of confusion, anger, and pain had only intensified as he realized he was now stranded in the cold without a single way to reach anyone. He stumbled back inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a dull thud. As he grasped the counter, trying to regain composure, a call came in. "Your car," a voice said, chillingly calm. "You know who's behind this." Terrence froze, a cold sweat running down his back. He turned, glancing at the empty room behind him, then out through the glass door into the shadows where the thief had disappeared. Who the hell was that? And what did they know? Before he could ask another question, the voice cut through the silence one more time. "You'll find out tomorrow. But you might wish you hadn't." A shiver ran down his spine. This was no ordinary theft. This was something else entirely. Terrence wiped his hands on the sides of his worn-out apron, feeling the subtle burn of the bleach lingering in his palms. The cafe was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the gentle scrape of his rag against the countertop. It was nearly closing time, the last remnants of the evening crowd trickling out into the chilly night air. A flicker of light danced across the front window from the street lamp outside. "Just one more hour," he muttered to himself, the words more of a mantra than a thought. He had been working this shift for months now, long enough to recognize the lonely cadence of these nights. The ones where you could feel time slip past you like sand through your fingers, while the rest of the world continued moving outside. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but before he could grab it, the door opened, and a cold gust of wind cut through the room, making the old light above the counter flicker. Terrence looked up, expecting to see someone who had stayed too long for their evening coffee. Instead, it was a man, rough around the edges, wearing a hoodie pulled low, his face shadowed by the hood's edge. He was tall, too tall. His body language was tense, as if he had walked into a place where he didn't belong. "Hey, you got change for a 20? The man asked, his voice raspy, unsteady. Terrence paused. Something about the request felt off. He met the stranger's gaze, trying to gauge his intentions. There was something unfamiliar about the man. Too quiet, too insistent, but Terrence had learned to keep things cordial. Sure," he said, sliding over a $10 bill. The man grabbed it too quickly, his fingers brushing against the edge of the counter. "Thanks," the man muttered, looking over his shoulder like he was checking for something or someone. Terrence didn't think much of it until the man turned and began heading toward the door. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the flash of movement, something metallic, something that glinted in the faint light of the cafe. His car keys. They were right there on the counter. Before he could react, the man was there, faster than he expected, his hand darting forward and grabbing the keys. The force of the motion startled Terrence, and his breath caught in his throat. "Hey, what?" The man shoved him back, hard, knocking Terrence into the counter. A jolt of pain shot up his spine, and his body slammed against the cold steel. "Give it back," Terrence stammered, panic rising in his chest. But the man wasn't listening. He moved like lightning, grabbing the keys, yanking open the door, and before Terrence could even catch his breath, the man was outside. The car's engine roared to life with a screech of tires. "Hey! Stop!" Terrence shouted, his voice breaking the silence of the night, but the thief was already speeding down the street, tires spinning wildly. Terrence stood frozen in the doorway, the cold night air biting at his skin as he tried to process what had just happened. The sound of the car fading into the distance left him paralyzed. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a second, he couldn't think of anything but the sickening feeling of helplessness that rose inside him. His first instinct was to run, to chase after his car, but his legs wouldn't move. All he could do was stand there, numb. He reached for his phone, but it had slipped down into the depths of his pocket, and the seconds stretched into what felt like eternity before his shaking hands could pull it free. His thumb hovered over the call button as he struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Had he just been robbed? No, it wasn't that simple. This wasn't just a random theft. He had felt it in the man's grip, the way he'd moved like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he'd been here before. As Terrence scrolled through the list of contacts, the cold grip of fear began to settle in. He called his cousin first. No answer. His mom. Nothing. The friends he might have reached out to. They'd all be asleep by now. His chest tightened as the reality of his situation sunk in. He was alone. The phone buzzed in his hand, and his heart skipped a beat. An unknown number. "Hello," he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Your car," a voice on the other end said, chillingly calm. "You know who's behind this." Terrence froze, his fingers tightening around the phone. His breath hitched. "Who is this?" he demanded, voice trembling. The voice laughed softly. "You'll find out tomorrow. But you might wish you hadn't." There was a pause, heavy with something dark, something Terrence couldn't quite place. The line went dead. Terrence stood there in the silence, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the cryptic words, the sudden violation. The man's warning had been deliberate. Whoever had taken his car, they weren't done with him. He turned back to the street, staring into the night. The empty road stretched out before him, a quiet witness to the chaos that had just begun. The world around him felt like it was closing in, and in that moment, Terrence knew that what had started as a simple theft had become something far more dangerous. Tomorrow. He didn't know who had just threatened him, but by tomorrow he would. The morning light crept through the blinds of Terrence's apartment, filtering through the dust that had settled overnight. It was barely 7 a.m., but sleep had been a fleeting visitor, the events of the previous night still haunting his mind. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sound cutting through the thick silence of the room. Terrence's hand shot out to grab it, almost instinctively, as if answering the call would make everything return to normal. But it didn't. He stared at the screen. Unknown number. His heart skipped, the memory of the voice from last night rushing back to him. Chill. The warning. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice more cautious than he had intended. There was a pause, a brief static hum, before the voice came through again. "Low, steady, almost familiar. You didn't think you'd get away with it, did you?" Terrence's stomach tightened, but he didn't respond. He gripped the phone tighter, trying to steady himself. "You should have known what this was about," the voice continued, its edge cutting through his thoughts. "You've been too blind. But now it's too late." The words made no sense. What was he talking about? Terrence could feel a cold sweat gathering on the back of his neck. I don't know what you mean. Who is this?" A low laugh echoed through the line before the voice returned with more chilling clarity. "It's already done. The car. You don't need it. And you won't need anything after what's coming." Before Terrence could say anything, the line went dead again. Silence enveloped him. He dropped the phone onto the bed, his mind spiraling with more questions than answers. He had to report the theft. That much was certain. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the theft wasn't just some random crime. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was orchestrated, planned. The voice, the coldness of it. It wasn't just about stealing a car. It was personal. After a long moment, he forced himself out of bed, the weight of his thoughts pressing against his chest as he grabbed his jacket and slipped on his shoes. He needed to get to the police. He needed answers. The police station was quiet when Terrence walked through the door. He hadn't been to this part of town much, but the stark, gray walls and the fluorescent lighting made the place feel even colder than the outside world. He approached the front desk, where a tired-looking officer sat. "Excuse me," Terrence started, his voice a little too thin. "I'd like to report a stolen car." The officer, a man with deep-set eyes and a wrinkled uniform, didn't look up at first. "And your name?" he asked, barely glancing at Terrence. "Terrence Williams," he replied, his frustration rising. "It was stolen last night. I need to file a report." Finally, the officer looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What kind of car?" "A 2012 Honda Civic. Blue." Terrence's hands clenched into fists as he remembered the gleam of the steering wheel. His father's old seatbelt hanging loosely by the side. His family's car. "Okay," the officer said flatly, motioning to the computer in front of him. "You got the plate number." Terrence recited it, and the officer punched it into the system. The hum of the computer filled the otherwise still room as the officer tapped a few more keys. "Looks like we don't have any reports of it yet. When did you say it was taken?" "Last night. Just after closing time at the cafe on Maple Street." The officer sighed, leaning back in his chair and folding his arms. "All right, here's the thing. Stolen cars. Happens all the time. And usually they show up somewhere after a couple days. We'll get around to it. Don't worry." Terrence's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about a car. He could feel it. He opened his mouth to protest, but the officer didn't let him get the words out. "Listen, man. You can't expect us to jump on every single car theft. It's not like you're dealing with some major criminal here. This happens every day." Terrence stared at the officer, trying to keep his composure. There was something about the man's dismissive tone that grated against him. He didn't just feel like a victim. He felt like he wasn't even being heard. The realization hit him then, that something deeper was at play here. This wasn't just apathy. This was something more. Terrence started again, but the officer interrupted. "Just file the report and we'll do our job." His voice was clipped, as if he had already decided that Terrence was just another case to push through. Terrence felt his throat tighten. He wanted to yell, to demand action, but all he did was nod. "All right," he muttered, turning away from the counter. As he walked out of the station, the heavy sense of frustration and powerlessness weighed on him like a boulder. The way the officer had dismissed him, as if he didn't matter, like his car was just another statistic, struck him deeply. But it wasn't just about the car. It wasn't just the theft. It was about everything that followed. The call, the voice, the way people acted like his life didn't matter. Terrence had spent the next few hours walking aimlessly around town, trying to shake off the anger building inside him. He was pacing near the alley behind the cafe when a voice called out to him. "You got a second?" Terrence turned, surprised to see someone he recognized. It was Jenna, a woman who used to work at the cafe with him. She had moved on to a better job a while back, but they had stayed in touch. She was a good person, smart, headstrong. "Jenna, what's up?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light despite the heaviness in his chest. She glanced around quickly, her eyes darting between him and the street. "I know what happened to your car. Heard something. You want to talk." Terrence raised an eyebrow. "You know something." "I can't say much, but I wouldn't trust the cops on this one. I think it's bigger than you realize. Someone's behind this, and it's not just about the car." Terrence felt his heart race. "Who? Who's behind it?" She hesitated, then gave him a quick, nervous glance. "Meet me tonight, same place after dark. I'll tell you what I know. But don't say anything to anyone else, okay? They're watching." Before Terrence could respond, Jenna was already gone, slipping into the shadows of the alley. His pulse pounded in his chest. Someone was watching. What was she talking about? And who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Terrence felt the weight of the mystery pressing harder. One thing was certain. He was going to find out who had stolen his car. And when he did, there would be consequences. The night had a way of cloaking everything in shadows, and as Terrence approached the alley where Jenna had told him to meet, the darkness seemed deeper than usual. The familiar streetlights cast eerie glows, flickering in the wind like dying stars, and the distant hum of cars on the highway felt muted, far away. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the world itself was conspiring to hold him back from the answers he needed. He found her standing near the back door of a closed bookstore, her silhouette barely visible against the brick wall. She looked out of place here, too nervous, too aware of her surroundings. Terrence swallowed his unease and walked up to her, his eyes scanning the street for any signs of movement. "You made it," Jenna said quietly, barely above a whisper. "I almost didn't," Terrence admitted, glancing over his shoulder. "What's going on, Jenna? Why all the secrecy?" She stepped closer, her eyes darting around once more before she spoke again. "I shouldn't even be talking to you about this, but I know you're not going to stop asking questions. Look, there's more to your car being stolen than just some random thief looking for an easy score. There's a reason it was you." Terrence frowned. "What do you mean, a reason?" Jenna sighed, rubbing her eyes as if trying to gather the strength to say the words. "That car, it didn't just belong to you. Not in the way you think." "What are you talking about?" "Your dad," she said, voice lowering even further. "Your dad used to work for the Revere family, right?" Terrence's chest tightened. The Reveres were one of the wealthiest families in the area, their name synonymous with power and influence. Terrence's father had worked for them years ago, in their vast estate on the outskirts of town. He had never said much about his time there, and after Terrence was born they had cut ties. But there was always a shadow over those years, one that had never fully been explained. Terrence had always been too young to understand the full weight of it. "Yeah," Terrence said, his voice trailing off. "My dad worked for them, but that was years ago. He never really talked about it much." Jenna shook her head, looking down at the ground. "That's because your father had to leave abruptly, didn't he? He walked away from a great job, a good life with them. But it wasn't by choice." Terrence felt his breath catch in his throat. He had always known that his father had left something behind, but hearing Jenna's words felt like the door to a long-forgotten chapter of his life was opening. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jenna took a deep breath, glancing nervously around before speaking again. "Your dad didn't just leave because he wanted a change. He left because of something he found out. Something he wasn't supposed to. He saw how the Reveres treated the people who worked for them, how they kept their business running. They had their hands in some really shady stuff, dirty money, under-the-table deals. It wasn't just business. It was personal." Terrence's head spun. His father, a man he'd always admired, had walked away from everything, not for a better job, but because of something he had uncovered. He felt the ground beneath him shift, his thoughts racing. "What does this have to do with my car?" Jenna hesitated, looking around again before leaning in closer. "The car you drive, it used to belong to one of the Reveres. Your father's boss, Samuel Revere. But it wasn't just any car. It was the one thing he took when he left. The car was a symbol of something." Terrence stood still, processing the information. "You're saying my dad stole from them?" Jenna nodded slowly. "In a way, yes. But not for money. He took that car because it was his only leverage. The Reveres were involved in something. Something bad. Your dad had evidence, he was going to expose them. And when they found out, they didn't let him go easily. He left, but they made sure he didn't take any more with him than that car. They made sure he stayed quiet." Terrence's thoughts scrambled to make sense of this. His father, someone he had looked up to all his life, had been involved in something dangerous, something shady. And now, years later, the very car he had driven away from the Reveres was the one that had been stolen from him. I don't understand," Terrence said, voice trembling. Why would they come after me now? Why would they take the car? I haven't even done anything. Jenna's eyes softened, her expression filled with empathy. 'Cause they know who you are. And they know you'll come looking for answers. That's what they want. You're connected to your father's past, whether you like it or not. And now, you're the one they need to silence. Terrence shook his head, unable to process everything she was saying. So what? I'm just supposed to let them get away with it. Let them walk all over me. I'm not saying that, Jenna replied, her voice firm now. But you need to be careful. These people, they don't just steal cars. They destroy lives. You have to understand that whatever your dad uncovered, they'll do anything to keep it buried. Terrence's mind was a blur of emotions. Anger, confusion, fear. It felt like his entire life had been flipped upside down in a matter of hours. But Jenna was right. Whoever had taken that car wasn't some petty thief. They were connected to something much bigger, something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. I'm going to find out what they're hiding, he said, his voice sharp with resolve. I'm not going to let them get away with this. Jenna gave him a long look, her eyes filled with worry. I hope you know what you're getting yourself into. As Terrence turned to leave, Jenna's voice called out one last time. Be careful, Terrence. You're not just fighting for your dad anymore. You're fighting for something bigger. The next few days passed in a haze of half-distracted moments and restless nights. Terrence couldn't shake the weight of Jenna's words, her warning still echoing in his mind. The connection between his father and the Reveres was something he hadn't expected, and it made everything feel different. The car wasn't just a stolen object, it was a key, a symbol of something hidden in the past, something powerful enough to make someone go to great lengths to erase it. He spent his days following leads, his nights alone in his apartment, the lingering sense of being watched never far from his thoughts. He tried to reach out to his family, but each time he got close to asking about his father's history with the Reveres, they either shut him down or changed the subject. They were hiding something, but they weren't ready to talk. Then came the moment he had been waiting for. His confrontation with the men who seemed to hold all the power in this town. Terrence was on his lunch break, walking along the quieter streets near the outskirts of town, when he saw them. 3 men in expensive suits standing outside the towering glass-fronted building where Revere Enterprises was headquartered. They looked out of place in the midday sunlight, like vultures waiting for something to die. One of them caught his eye, a man with dark sunglasses who, for a fleeting moment, seemed to recognize him. Terrence quickly averted his gaze, but the recognition was mutual. These were the men who had been pulling the strings for years, the ones whose names were never mentioned in polite conversation, but whose influence stretched into every corner of the town. The Reveres and their associates. He kept walking, pretending not to notice, but something nagged at him. A low voice in his head telling him to turn back, to not get involved. But the pull of the truth was stronger than his fear. He had to know. It wasn't long before Terrence found himself outside the polished glass doors of Revere Enterprises. His mind spinning with conflicting thoughts. He had to find a way in, he had to talk to someone. A few minutes later, he stepped into the sleek lobby, trying his best to look confident despite the knot of anxiety twisting in his gut. The receptionist at the desk barely glanced at him. Her name tag read Sarah, but her cold smile didn't match the warmth of her name. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice as flat as the polished marble floor beneath his feet. "I'm here to speak with someone in charge," Terrence said, his voice steady. "Someone who can tell me about Samuel Revere and his involvement in past dealings." Sarah's smile faltered, but only for a second. "I'm afraid you'll have to make an appointment. The Reveres aren't available to just anyone." Terrence's fists clenched at his sides. This was what he had expected. Bureaucratic red tape meant to keep people like him out. But he wasn't about to give up. "I'm not leaving until I talk to someone," he said, his voice low but determined. Sarah raised an eyebrow, then glanced at something behind him, her gaze flicking toward the door. Terrence turned just in time to see the man from outside the building, the one with the sunglasses, enter the lobby. His smile was cold, and his eyes locked onto Terrence with unsettling clarity. "Is there a problem here, Sarah?" the man asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. Terrence's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "No problem at all, Mr. Carter," Sarah said, almost too quickly. "This gentleman was asking about Mr. Revere." Mr. Carter smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made Terrence feel small, insignificant. "Well," Mr. Carter said, stepping closer, "I'm afraid you'll have to leave. Mr. Revere isn't available, and you're wasting both your time and ours." Terrence stood tall, his spine straightening despite the nerves crawling through his skin. He wasn't about to back down now, not when he was this close. "I know what's going on," Terrence said, his voice tight. "I know your dirty little secrets, Carter. The way your family works behind the scenes. I won't stop until I get answers. And if you're involved in all of this, I'll make sure the whole town knows who you really are." Mr. Carter's expression didn't change. He didn't seem angry, didn't even seem surprised. It was almost as though he'd expected this. "I think you've misunderstood something," he said calmly. "You don't get to make the rules here. People like you don't have the luxury of asking questions. You're too small, too insignificant." Terrence clenched his fists, his blood running cold. The arrogance in Carter's voice, the way he dismissed him without a second thought, it was like a slap to the face. "I'm not going anywhere until I get what I came for," Terrence spat, his anger bubbling over. "Tell me where I can find Samuel Revere. I won't stop until I get answers." Carter's cold smile remained as he took a step closer. "You'll regret this, Mr. Williams," he said quietly, almost as though it were a whisper meant just for Terrence. "You really don't understand what you're up against, do you?" Before Terrence could respond, two more men in suits appeared at the door, blocking the exit. Their faces were unreadable, but their presence was enough to send a wave of fear coursing through his veins. "We'll be escorting you out," Carter said, his tone cold but final. As the men guided him to the door, Terrence's mind raced. The entire building, the entire family, was a fortress of power, impenetrable, cold, and built on a foundation of secrets. And he had just scratched the surface. But as he was pushed out into the bright sunlight, the anger inside him burned hotter than ever. This wasn't over. No matter what Carter or anyone else said, he wouldn't stop until he knew the truth. They thought they could intimidate him. They thought they could scare him into silence. But Terrence was done being afraid. Terrence's heart was still pounding when he stepped away from Revere Enterprises, but it wasn't just fear that coursed through his veins. Anger swelled inside him, a burning drive to keep pushing forward, to uncover the truth no matter the cost. They thought they could intimidate him. They thought he would back down. But the deeper he went into this mess, the more determined he became. The car, his father's past, the hidden secrets, all of it tied into something far larger than a simple robbery. This wasn't just about the theft of a vehicle. It was about power, systemic control, a dynasty built on manipulation, exploitation, and cover-ups. The Reveres were untouchable. But Terrence had learned that those in power never stayed untouchable forever. He needed a plan. The next few days felt like a blur of small, scattered steps. Terrence began reaching out to people in his network, those who might know something about the Revere's dirty dealings. Ex-employees, long-forgotten acquaintances, anyone who could help him piece together the history that had been buried so carefully. He didn't trust the police anymore, not after the way he'd been dismissed and ignored. He needed someone who wasn't afraid of the Revere name. One of his calls finally paid off. Darius, a former construction worker who had once done some work on the Revere estate, agreed to meet Terrence late one evening. Darius had left the Revere family's employ years ago, after an accident on the job had been swept under the rug. He'd never received compensation, and the Revere family had done everything in their power to keep him quiet. Terrence met him outside a rundown diner on the edge of town, the kind of place that still clung to its 1970s neon glow. Darius sat in a booth near the back, a dark figure in a worn jacket. When Terrence sat down across from him, the man's face was hard, but there was a sense of wariness in his eyes. "Terrence Williams, right?" Darius said, his voice low and gravelly. He didn't shake Terrence's hand, but his eyes seemed to appraise him like an old acquaintance. "Yeah, that's me," Terrence replied, his voice tight with anticipation. "You worked for the Reveres. Can you tell me about them? About what you saw?" Darius shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced around the diner nervously before he leaned in closer. "I don't talk about them," Darius muttered. "It's dangerous." "Why? What happened?" "Those people, those families, they control everything here," Darius said, his eyes darkening as he leaned back in his seat. "I don't know how much you know, but it's all connected. Business, politics, even the police. They've got their hands in everything. The Reveres, the Colvins, the Freemans. They're like kings, Manitoba. And when you try to cross them, you disappear. Not physically, no. But they ruin you. They bury you where no one can see. They'll destroy your reputation, your life. Whatever it takes." Terrence absorbed the words like a sponge. He had suspected as much, the insidious way the town's elite controlled the strings from the shadows, but hearing it confirmed made it feel all the more real. "What are they doing that's so bad?" Terrence asked, leaning forward now. "I know they're involved in something, but I can't prove anything yet." Darius looked around again before continuing, his voice barely a whisper. "You ever hear of the Elms Project?" Terrence frowned. The name wasn't familiar, but there was a certain weight in the air when Darius said it, something heavy and dangerous. "No, what's that?" "The Elms Project was an old development project," Darius said. "It was supposed to be a big deal. They were going to build a whole neighborhood over on the west side of town. New homes, new businesses, the whole works. But it was never finished. And the Revere family. They were at the center of it all." Terrence sat back in his seat, his mind racing. "But why is it important now? What happened to the project?" Darius took a long pause, his eyes flicking to the window behind Terrence before he spoke again. "They called it a failure. Collapse. But the truth is, it didn't collapse because of bad planning or bad construction. It collapsed because they were laundering money through the project. They were using it to funnel dirty cash through multiple channels. Real estate deals, phony investments, you name it. It was all a front to cover up some bigger dealings. Drugs, weapons. I'm telling you, it was bad. Your father, he found out about it. That's why he had to leave. He tried to go public with it, and they shut him down before he could get the word out." Terrence's head spun as he processed the information. His father had left not because of a better job opportunity or a need to escape the grind of work. He had left because he had been involved in uncovering something massive, something that, if exposed, would have brought down the whole system the Reveres had built. And now, years later, the same men were pulling strings behind the scenes, erasing all traces of their dirty work, like it had never happened. "So, what happens now?" Terrence asked, his voice hoarse. "How do I stop them?" Darius sighed deeply, his eyes filled with regret. "You don't. Not easily. You think you can take on people like that. They control everything. If you keep digging, you'll end up like me. Unemployed, blacklisted. You're already in too deep, Terrence. You've got to let it go." Terrence's chest tightened. This was the moment he had feared. The moment when the people in the know told him it was too late. But he couldn't stop now. He had to keep going, not just for the car, not just for his father, but for the truth. "I'm not backing down," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to expose them, no matter what it takes." Darius shook his head. "I hope you know what you're getting yourself into. But if you're set on this, I'll help you. Just, don't say I didn't warn you." As Terrence walked out of the diner, his mind was a whirlwind. He had known there was corruption, but the depth of it, the web of lies, the money laundering, the way the Reveres had hidden their tracks, was more than he had imagined. They were untouchable, yes, but they weren't invincible. He had just gotten his first real lead. And now, the real fight was about to begin. The days following his meeting with Darius were filled with a mix of unease and determination. Terrence had finally begun to see the cracks in the Revere family's perfect facade. He had a clearer picture now. Money laundering, illicit dealings, and connections stretching from the streets to the highest offices in the town. His father had tried to expose it, and now, in his absence, Terrence had to finish what his father started. But it wasn't going to be easy. If anything, the truth seemed more dangerous than ever. Terrence's phone had begun buzzing with ominous messages. No calls, just short, cryptic texts that hinted at the mounting pressure he was about to face. The first came the morning after his conversation with Darius. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're digging into things you won't be able to undo. Leave it alone." He'd ignored it, but it hadn't stopped. Each time he tried to move forward, each time he tried to talk to someone who might have answers, he was met with more resistance. The people who worked with him, the people he trusted, suddenly they were all too busy, too afraid. No one wanted to get involved. One afternoon, Terrence found himself walking through the park near his apartment, trying to clear his mind. The breeze was cool, and the sun had just started dipping behind the horizon. As he passed the old fountain near the benches, he heard a voice behind him. "Terrence!" He spun around to find Officer Daniels standing there, his badge catching the last light of the day. The same officer who had dismissed his car theft report in the police station a few days earlier. Terrence narrowed his eyes. "I need to talk to you," Daniels said, his voice low. "Alone." Terrence crossed his arms, unsure of what to expect. Officer Daniels had been unhelpful before, but now, something in his demeanor made Terrence think this conversation wasn't about the theft anymore. He motioned toward the empty bench nearby. "What's this about?" Terrence asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Daniels sat down, his face betraying no emotion. For a moment there was just silence. Then he spoke. "Listen, I don't know who you've been talking to, but you're stirring up trouble. You need to stop." Terrence's pulse quickened. "What do you mean by that? What kind of trouble?" Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I'm not going to say much more than that. Just understand this. There are people here who will make sure you don't get any closer to the truth. People with power, people who control this town. You're already on their radar. I'm trying to help you, Terrence. Don't push them any further." Terrence swallowed hard, anger rising in his chest. "You're saying I should just stop? Let them get away with everything?" Daniels sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if exhausted by the conversation. "I'm not saying that. But I'm telling you, this isn't some small-time theft or a neighborhood dispute. You're dealing with a network that goes back years. And once they've decided you're a problem, it's over." Terrence's hands clenched into fists, frustration clouding his thoughts. "Why are you telling me this? What's your stake in this?" "Let's just say I've seen what they can do," Daniel said quietly. "And I don't want to see you end up like some of the others, people who tried to take them down. People who disappeared without a trace." The officer stood up, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "This town has a way of taking care of its problems. Don't be one of them." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the twilight. Terrence stood frozen, the weight of Daniel's words hanging heavy in the air. He had been warned. His pursuit of justice had made him a target. The message was clear: stop or face the consequences. But Terrence wasn't the type to back down. His father had fought for what was right. He couldn't let the Reveres get away with it. Not now. Not after everything he had learned. The pressure wasn't just coming from the police. In the days that followed, Terrence found himself the subject of whispers and cold stares. People who once greeted him with friendly smiles now turned their faces when he passed. A subtle form of intimidation, silent but effective. He could feel the weight of the town's collective disapproval. The walls were closing in on him. It wasn't until he received the next call that things took a darker turn. His phone rang just before midnight, the unknown number flashing on the screen again. Terrence hesitated, but he answered. "Hello." His voice was barely a whisper, the silence of the night making everything feel more tense than usual. "Terrence." The voice on the other end was chillingly calm. "We've been watching you. You've made your intentions clear, but let me tell you this. You're not going to get the answers you want. You're already too deep. It's not just the Reveres you're up against. There are forces far bigger than you, and they will make sure you stop. Understand?" Terrence's heart thudded in his chest. The voice sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. "I'm not afraid of you," Terrence said. His voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The voice laughed softly. "You will be. I promise you that." The line went dead. The next morning, as Terrence went about his usual routine, the weight of the threat still hung over him. Every step he took, every glance from a stranger, seemed like a reminder that his fight was now everyone's fight. The people watching him weren't just watching, they were waiting for him to fail, to give up. But giving up wasn't an option. He couldn't walk away now. He had seen enough, heard enough, to know that the Reveres weren't just criminals. They were the architects of a system that had been exploiting and manipulating the town for generations. They controlled everything. The police, the businesses, the media. They had built this empire on the backs of people like Terrence's father, and now it was his turn to tear it down. But as he looked around, he realized that he wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for his survival. The oppressive silence of Terrence's apartment felt like a weight on his chest as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of notes and papers spread out before him. He had been piecing things together for weeks now, talking to anyone who might know something, following every thread that might unravel the tangled web the Reveres had woven over the years. Every lead seemed to take him further into a maze of lies and corruption, but with each passing day, his resolve only grew stronger. It was almost as though the universe itself was conspiring against him, throwing roadblocks in his way at every turn. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything he had learned. As he flipped through his notes one last time, he noticed something he had missed before. A name. A name buried deep in the paperwork Darius had given him. The name of a contact who could provide the missing piece of the puzzle. Someone who had been directly involved in the Elms project. Someone who had seen it all unfold before it was shut down. Terrence wasted no time. He grabbed his coat, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the buttons. This was it, the chance he had been waiting for. This person had the answers he needed, and Terrence was ready to confront them, no matter what. The address was on the outskirts of town, far from the usual hustle and bustle of downtown. It was an old industrial area, the kind of place that time had forgotten. Terrence parked his car a few blocks away and walked down the narrow, crumbling street, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The buildings were run down, their windows boarded up, the faint smell of rot hanging in the air. The place he was looking for was a small, nondescript warehouse at the end of the street. It looked abandoned, but there was a faint light coming from beneath the door. Terrence's pulse quickened as he approached, his breath visible in the cold night air. He knocked on the door 3 times, each knock louder than the last. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a man standing in the shadows. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of quiet authority that instantly put Terrence on edge. "You Terrence Williams?" the man asked, his voice low but commanding. Terrence nodded. "Yeah, I'm looking for information about the Elms project. I've been told you know something." The man stepped aside, gesturing for Terrence to enter. "Come in. We've got a lot to talk about." Inside, the warehouse was filled with old, dusty crates and stacks of paper. It looked like no one had worked here in years, but there was a strange sense of urgency in the air. The man led Terrence to a small desk in the corner, where several files were spread out. "You've been asking the right questions," the man said, taking a seat across from him. "I'm sure you've already heard the stories, the ones they want to keep buried." Terrence sat down, his hands clenched in his lap. I need to know the truth. What happened with the Elms project? Why did it fall apart? The man leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. You want to know why it failed? The Elms project didn't fail, Terrence. It was sabotaged. From the inside. Terrence's breath caught in his throat. Sabotaged? What do you mean? It wasn't a construction problem or a financial issue. It was a cover-up. The Reveres were using the project as a front to launder money, yes, but that wasn't all. They were also using it to funnel weapons and illegal goods across state lines. The project was a way to hide what they were really doing behind closed doors. And when your father started poking around, they couldn't let him expose it. So they made sure the project never saw the light of day. Terrence's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. His father had stumbled onto something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. A criminal operation that involved not just the Reveres, but also a network of people tied to some of the most powerful institutions in the country. What happened to my dad? Terrence asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's face softened, a flicker of regret passing through his eyes. They scared him off, Terrence. They made it clear that if he didn't leave, they'd destroy everything he had worked for. And they almost did. Your father didn't just leave town, he disappeared. They made sure no one would hear from him again. The words hit Terrence like a physical blow. His father, a man who had always been his hero, had been forced to leave everything behind to protect his family. And now, years later, Terrence was faced with the same battle. I can't stop now, Terrence said, more to himself than to the man across from him. I have to finish this. I have to expose them. The man nodded, his gaze steady. I understand. But you need to know something. The Reveres will do anything to keep their empire intact. Anything. And they have the resources to make sure you never get close to the truth. Terrence stood up, determination settling in his chest. I don't care. I'll do whatever it takes. The man reached into one of the crates beside him and pulled out a file. He slid it across the table toward Terrence. This is everything I have on the Elms project. Everything you need to take them down. But be careful. Once you open that file, there's no turning back. Terrence hesitated for a moment, but then, without another word, he grabbed the file. It was thick, filled with documents, photographs, and records that painted a picture of the Revere's corruption, an empire built on lies, violence, and greed. As he left the warehouse, the file clutched tightly in his hands. Terrence knew that the fight was only just beginning. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, and soon, he would have the evidence he needed to bring the Reveres down. But at what cost? The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him, but there was no turning back now. He had come too far, and the truth was too dangerous to hide any longer. This concludes Chapter 7. If you're ready for Chapter 8, just type "continue," and I'll proceed. Terrence sat in his apartment, the dim light of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The file lay in front of him, the weight of its contents pressing down on him. He had gone through every page, every document, every photograph, every incriminating piece of evidence. What he had uncovered was beyond anything he could have imagined. The Reveres had built an empire on criminal activities that spanned decades. Money laundering, illegal arms deals, bribery, extortion. They were involved in it all. And now, finally, Terrence had the proof. But the realization that he had the power to expose them only brought a surge of anxiety. The fear that had gripped him ever since he had first stepped into this fight felt heavier now. He wasn't just up against the Reveres. He was up against a system, a network of power that reached from the town streets to the highest echelons of politics and business. They had the resources, the influence, and the ability to crush anyone who dared challenge them. And yet he couldn't stop. He couldn't walk away now, not when he had the truth in his hands. His father had fought for what was right, and Terrence was determined to finish the fight. The next morning, Terrence made a call that would change everything. He reached out to a local investigative journalist, a woman named Ava Simmons who had been digging into the Revere's activities for years. She had a reputation for exposing corruption, and though her work had often been ignored or suppressed, she had the resources and the courage Terrence needed. When Ava picked up the phone, her voice was cautious, but it carried the edge of someone who had been burned by this fight before. "I know who you are," she said. "And I know what you've been digging into. But I don't get involved in things unless I know the full picture. What do you have?" Terrence hesitated, glancing at the file on the table in front of him. Felt like a ticking bomb. "I've got everything. I know about the Elms project. I know about the money laundering. I know about the weapons deals. And I've got proof, photos, records, everything." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Ava spoke again. "You've got a death wish, don't you? You realize what you're asking me to do, right?" "I'm asking you to help me take them down," Terrence replied, his voice steady. "We have the truth, Ava. We can expose them." Ava was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was firmer, resolved. "All right, I'll help you. But this isn't going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. The Reveres are connected to too many people. We'll need a lot more than just this file. We need proof that they can't escape. But if you're in, I'm in." Terrence felt a rush of relief mixed with something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. "I'm in," he said without hesitation. Over the next few days, Terrence and Ava worked tirelessly. They met in secret, exchanging information and making plans. They reached out to other journalists, other whistleblowers who had tried to expose the Reveres in the past. They built a case, layer by layer, as they compiled everything they had gathered. It wasn't long before they had everything they needed. Hard evidence of illegal transactions, wiretap recordings of shady conversations, photographs of off-the-books meetings between the Reveres and known criminals. The more they uncovered, the more Terrence realized just how deep the corruption went. The Reveres weren't just the puppeteers. They were the architects of a system that had been exploiting people for generations. The damage they had caused couldn't be undone overnight. But they weren't going to stop until the truth came out. The day they were finally ready to go public, Terrence stood in front of Ava's office, the file in his hand. His heart was racing. This was it. The moment of reckoning. They had spent so long piecing this together, but now that the time had come, the weight of it was almost too much to bear. "You ready?" Ava asked, standing beside him, her eyes dark with determination. Terrence nodded, swallowing hard. "Ready." Together, they walked into the news station's office, where a team of reporters and legal experts were already waiting. They handed over the file, and as Ava began to brief the team, Terrence's thoughts turned to his father. The man who had sacrificed everything to protect his family. The man who had tried to expose the Reveres and had paid the price. Terrence had promised himself he wouldn't back down. And now, with the evidence in his hands, he was about to fulfill that promise. Hours later, the story hit the airwaves. The broadcast began with a series of shocking revelations. News footage showed photos of the Reveres at private meetings with criminals. Audio recordings of phone calls detailing illegal transactions. Bank statements that revealed millions of dollars funneled through the Elms project. The story was a bombshell, one that would send shockwaves through the community. The Reveres didn't react publicly at first. They were too powerful, too well guarded to let a few news reports bother them. But as the days passed, their empire began to unravel. Investigations were launched, and the police force, previously complacent and complicit, was forced to act. It wasn't long before Samuel Revere, the patriarch of the family, was arrested. The charges piled up quickly. Money laundering, arms dealing, bribery, and a slew of other crimes. But it wasn't just him. As the investigation continued, other prominent figures in the town were implicated. Business leaders, politicians, even police officers. The network that the Reveres had built, one that had protected them for so long, began to crack under the weight of the truth. Terrence watched as the Reveres were publicly brought down, one by one. The emotional toll on him was heavy, but the satisfaction of seeing them face justice was undeniable. He had exposed them. He had brought their empire crashing down. But there was no celebration. No victory dance. Because Terrence knew the cost. He had lost so much in this fight. His peace of mind, his trust in the system, his relationship with his family. And though the Reveres had been taken down, the scars of this battle would stay with him forever. A few weeks later, Terrence stood at his father's grave, the weight of the past still heavy on his shoulders. The file had been closed, the case had been won, but the pain of the journey remained. He had done what his father could never finish, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't truly over. The system that had protected the Reveres was still there. The damage they had done wasn't easily erased. But Terrence had learned one thing through it all. The truth was a weapon. And as long as people like him kept fighting for it, the powerful couldn't hide forever. With one last look at his father's grave, Terrence turned and walked away, ready to face whatever came next. The dust had barely settled, but the weight of what had transpired lingered. The Reveres were gone. Their empire, so carefully constructed over decades, had crumbled, and their names, once synonymous with power, were now tarnished beyond repair. The truth, so long buried, had been exposed. But in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Terrence found himself wondering if justice had really been served, or if the victory had come at too high a cost. As the legal proceedings against the Reveres and their associates continued, Terrence was left to pick up the pieces of his own life. The town was shaken, but it wasn't just the Reveres who had fallen. It was the entire system that had protected them, the system that had turned a blind eye to the suffering of so many. The shock waves of the scandal rippled through every corner of the community, exposing the cracks in a foundation built on corruption. Terrence had become something of a local hero. His name often mentioned in hushed tones. His story circulating like folklore. He had been brave enough to take down the Reveres, to fight back against the forces that had kept the town in their grip for so long. But the public praise did little to soothe the ache in his chest. It had been 2 weeks since the story broke, and yet, the weight of the aftermath seemed heavier with each passing day. Terrence found himself walking the streets, trying to regain some semblance of normalcy. People looked at him differently now, some with admiration, others with fear, unsure of where they stood in this new world he had created. They'd heard the story, seen the news reports, and perhaps, for the first time, realized just how deeply they had been complicit in the system that had allowed the Reveres to thrive. It was in this uncertain atmosphere that Terrence found himself back at the cafe. His old refuge. He hadn't been there much since everything had happened, but something about the familiar warmth of the place felt comforting now. As he walked in, he was greeted by the soft hum of the espresso machine and the low murmur of conversations. It was almost the same as it had always been. But as Terrence sat down at his usual spot, a feeling of isolation crept in. The cafe felt different now. He felt different. The work that had consumed him for so long, the anger, the need for justice, it had all come to an end. And now he had to figure out how to live with the aftermath. Terrence. He looked up to find Jenna standing in front of him, her face a mixture of concern and relief. It had been a while since they'd spoken, since the last time they'd met in the alley, before everything had exploded into chaos. "Jenna," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "How are you?" She slid into the seat across from him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge what he was feeling. "I'm good. Better. I heard the Reveres are done. It's over." Terrence nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. He wasn't sure what to say. "Yeah, it's over." There was a long pause, and Terrence felt the weight of the unspoken words between them. She had helped him in ways he couldn't even begin to thank her for, offering information, risking her own safety to point him in the right direction. But there was something more. The cost of all of this hadn't been just physical. It had taken a toll on his relationships too. "I saw your father's name in the papers," Jenna said quietly. They finally acknowledged what they did to him. Terrence stiffened at the mention of his father. His father's name had been part of the public record for the first time in years, but it hadn't been for anything good. The Reveres had ruined his father's life, just as they had tried to ruin Terrence's. I still don't know if it was worth it, Terrence admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenna reached across the table, placing her hand gently on his. It was worth it, Terrence. You took down the people who destroyed your father, who tore this town apart. What you did mattered. It will matter for a long time. Terrence met her gaze, her eyes filled with empathy and understanding. He hadn't expected to find solace in someone else's words, but there it was. Her presence offering a quiet sense of peace, even as the world around him seemed to be slowly recovering from the shock of what had happened. He knew the journey had been hard, but he also knew that he wasn't done yet. The investigation into the Reveres had uncovered much, but it hadn't uncovered everything. There were still people in positions of power who had managed to escape the fallout, people who had hidden in the shadows while the Reveres took the fall. Terrence could feel it, the lingering sense that the battle was far from over. Even as the town celebrated the fall of the Reveres, he knew that their system, the system of power, manipulation, and silence, was still in place. Terrence's phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced down to see a message from Ava. We've got more. They're already trying to cover their tracks. Stay vigilant. The war isn't over. Terrence's chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. The fight wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The Reveres may have been exposed, but their influence ran deep, and there were still enemies lurking in the corners, waiting for the right moment to strike. He stood up, his resolve hardening. He couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until the last thread was unraveled, until the entire system of corruption was brought to its knees. As he walked out of the cafe, the air seemed a little heavier, but also a little clearer. The journey was far from over, but at least now, Terrence knew what he was fighting for. Terrence walked through the town with a new sense of purpose, though the weight of everything that had happened still pressed down on him. The Reveres had been exposed, but the aftershocks of their fall were still rippling through the community. For so long, the town had been a place of quiet oppression, hidden in plain sight, where people had looked away when the powerful played their games. Now the veil was torn, and the true cost of the Revere's rule was laid bare. But Terrence wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. Now it was personal. His father's name had been sullied for years, and despite the revelations, the community's treatment of his family had not changed overnight. Terrence had made the Reveres pay for their crimes, but what did that mean if the system that allowed them to thrive still existed? He had taken down a dynasty, but the roots of that dynasty were still buried deep within the town's infrastructure, its politics, and its institutions. The question loomed heavy in his mind. Had he truly won, or had he simply struck a blow that would only provoke a deeper resistance? As the weeks passed, the investigation into the Reveres continued. The media, once flooded with a scandal, had begun to move on to other stories. But for Terrence, this wasn't something that could simply be forgotten. The Reveres' empire might have crumbled, but the people they had left behind were still in positions of power. The network of corruption hadn't been fully exposed. It was still lurking in the shadows, quietly rebuilding. Terrence knew that if he was going to finish what his father started, he couldn't afford to rest. He had made too many enemies, and the forces against him were still very much in play. The battle had shifted from a war of exposure to one of survival. He would have to navigate a world where the threat of retaliation was always present, a world where people who once held power would stop at nothing to protect their interests. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk at the small legal office he'd rented, Terrence received a call. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, one he hadn't heard in weeks. "Terrence," Ava's voice crackled through the line. "I've got something. A big lead." Terrence's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "Remember the Colvins?" she asked. They were always close to the Reveres, pulling the strings in the background. "The media's mostly moved on, but I've been getting reports. People are talking about how the Colvins are trying to pick up the pieces of what the Reveres left behind." Terrence leaned back in his chair, a familiar anger rising in his chest. The Colvins were another powerful family in the town, just as entrenched in the system of corruption as the Reveres had been. So, they're trying to take control now that the Reveres are out of the picture? Exactly, Ava said. But I've uncovered something else. There's a meeting planned. A big one with all the top players, people you wouldn't expect. And it's happening soon. If we can get the right people on the inside, we might be able to bring down the whole operation. Terrence's mind raced. This was the opening he'd been waiting for. The Colvens were not just a power structure, they were the last piece of the puzzle. If he could expose them, he could make sure that the systems of power that allowed the Reveres, the Colvens, and everyone else to thrive would finally crumble. He would be able to rid the town of its chains once and for all. When is the meeting? Terrence asked, his voice low with determination. Next week, Ava replied. I've got someone on the inside. But we'll need to move quickly. If we don't act fast enough, this could slip away. Terrence paused, weighing his options. The risks were enormous, but he couldn't turn back now. Not when he was this close. We're in. Let's do it. The next week passed in a blur. Terrence and Ava worked tirelessly to gather information and make the necessary connections. The meeting was scheduled to take place in an old, secluded estate on the outskirts of town, one that had long been rumored to be a hub for underground dealings. They spent the days leading up to it making plans, securing allies, and preparing for the risks they would face. Terrence knew that this wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about disrupting an entire system. He wasn't just fighting for himself or for his father. He was fighting for the entire town, for the people who had suffered under the weight of corruption for far too long. The night of the meeting arrived, and with it, the quiet tension of the unknown. Terrence and Ava arrived at the estate, their faces masked by the shadows. The estate was heavily guarded, but they had managed to slip past unnoticed. Inside, the rooms were lavishly decorated, but there was an eerie feeling in the air, as though the space had been long abandoned by those who once called it home. Terrence's heart raced as he and Ava made their way through the corridors, searching for the room where the meeting was to take place. They had to act quickly. One wrong move, one mistake, and everything could be lost. Finally, they found it. A large conference room, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, the Colvens were seated at a long table, surrounded by other influential figures, businessmen, politicians, and former law enforcement officers. Terrence's stomach tightened as he recognized the faces of the people who had controlled this town for far too long. Ava slipped through the door first, signaling to Terrence to follow. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "What's this?" a voice asked, cutting through the murmur of the room. One of the Colvens stood up, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Terrence and Ava. "You're too late, Williams. You think you can stop us?" Terrence stepped forward, the file he had been carrying in his hand. "It's not too late," he said, his voice steady. "But it will be for you, Cole. The people you've been using for so long are watching. This is where it ends." The room erupted in chaos as the truth was finally laid bare. The Colvens, like the Reveres before them, couldn't hide behind their wealth and influence any longer. With the evidence Terrence had gathered, the entire network of corruption was exposed, and the Colvens were forced to face the consequences of their actions. As the dust settled, Terrence stood outside the estate, the weight of everything that had happened crashing down on him. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory, one that felt hard-won. The town was beginning to change. The people who had lived in fear for so long were starting to find their voice, starting to see that they weren't powerless. Terrence looked up at the night sky, a faint smile on his lips. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a future, one where the truth could finally take root and justice could thrive.